Hi there, it's Holy Week, and I'm going to share a sermon that I prepared for Palm Sunday. We're on the way to Easter with Jesus. I think at the moment it's important that we're thinking during Holy Week about what's going on over in Palestine and Israel. On Palm Sunday, the only Christian hospital in Gaza was actually bombed by the Israeli Defense Force, and it seems like it couldn't be a coincidence that that happened at the beginning of the week that's most important to Christians, and on a day that has been a day where we declare our commitment to peace and to peacemaking and to non-violent resistance to evil. But the reading is from Luke 19, verse 28 to 40. So feel free to pause the video and have a read of that. But you might also want to have a look at what Jesus is saying just before this. In the section before this, Jesus has been telling a story about a local noble who has gone to a faraway emperor to ask if he can be the king of the place where he's living. And his neighbors don't want him to be the king. They don't want this noble to be their king. But the emperor makes him king. And that is basically what the house of Herod had done. They had been made kings by the Roman emperor at their own request. They had gone to Rome and asked, can we be the kings of our people? So yeah, read Luke 19, 28 to 40, and then start the video up again. We're continuing on the way with Jesus toward Easter, and now we're very close to the end of the journey. We walk with Jesus as he parades into Jerusalem, the holy city of the Jewish people. It's Passover, the time when the Jewish people remember the story of God freeing their ancestors from slavery and leading them into the good life. But the fact is that the Passover tells us that there was actually two parades into the city going on, because from the west side of the city there was a procession led by Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, who we're going to hear more about on Good Friday. And he was marching into the city with a whole lot of soldiers, showing the strength of the Roman Empire, reminding the people that Rome's strength and Rome's weapons were what had brought peace. Peace through the threat of violence, peace at the edge of a sword. And they did this because they knew that this was the time when Jewish people remember the Passover and remember God freeing their ancestors from slavery. So often during the Passover, Jewish people would look around and see that they were no longer free. They were under slavery again under the Romans. They were under occupation by the Romans, and they would yearn for freedom again, and they would be tempted to rebel. They'd be tempted to rebel against the occupying forces. And that's why the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, was having this parade, to show how strong his forces were, to show off the swords and shields and armor and spears and horses that they had, which would be what confronted the people if they rebelled. In this story, we have an account of Jesus leading the people in his own procession. And you might notice that this version of the story from Luke, it's different to other versions if you look in the other Gospels. I know when my dad gets together with his brothers, they tell stories of the family, and they always have different versions. Everyone has a different reason for the way that they tell the story. And everyone sees different meanings and different motivations in family stories, and the Gospels are a bit like that. Each one tells the story in ways that tell us about the impression that Jesus made on the communities that those Gospels came from. So in some versions, Jesus is riding a donkey, or even riding two donkeys. But in this version, instead of riding a war horse like Pilate would have been, Jesus is riding a young horse that has never been trained, a young horse that's still young and wild and has never been used in war. And there are no imperial banners like the governor has. Instead, the people put their own everyday cloaks out to make the way for the parade. In other versions of the story, people are carrying branches and waving them like it's a joyful festival instead of carrying swords and spears like the Roman soldiers marching on the other side of the city. People would see this as like the arrival of a peaceful and benevolent king. And they announce that Jesus is king. They announce that peace is arriving without the threat of weapons. This is not the peace of coercive power that comes from above. It's the peace of people standing and marching together in power together without weapons. And the Pharisees tell Jesus to stop. They're probably worried about what will happen if Jesus' unarmed procession meets Pilate's procession with their swords and spears and war horses. And ancient Christians who heard this story, they would have known what happened afterwards. They would know what happened after the time of Jesus. Some of them would have experienced the rebellion that happened in Jerusalem. The Jewish people were able to kick the Romans out of Jerusalem, but the city was still surrounded by the Roman army. Nobody could get in or out, and people in the city couldn't get food, like in Gaza at the moment. Eventually, the Romans took over the city again, and they knocked down the Jewish temple that King Herod had built so that the stones were scattered. If the Pharisees are worried about a violent confrontation, Jesus says they can't stop their demonstration for that reason. They have to demonstrate his way of peace to the people. If they don't announce this way of peace, the scattered stones of the temple and the city walls are going to cry out as the city is destroyed. In Britain and Germany and Sudan and Japan and Ukraine and in Palestine, destroyed cities cry out to us, telling us that the way of peace is what we need. It's likely that this parade and the demonstration that Jesus leads in the temple afterwards are the main reasons why the Roman governor and the Roman appointed king and the Jewish leaders running the temple would have wanted to work together to have Jesus executed within the next week. We should be aware that standing for peace and justice will lead us into conflict with the powers of the world. That's the direction Jesus is leading us in this week. In the last week, I was encouraged to be in touch with some folks who are living in Bethlehem, close to the edge of Israel. So like it's in Palestine, but close to the border with Israel. And they have been reaching out to people on the other side of the border in efforts to make relationships that can lead to peace. And it means that everybody is unhappy with them a lot of the time. Some of their workers, some of their comrades have died in the pursuit of peace, but they're leading the way to peace and justice by reaching out to their neighbours in peace and love and support of justice. They're basically mothers reaching out to each other across the border in a time of violence. And this, I think, demonstrates to us what Jesus was on about, the pursuit of peace and the resistance of violence in a peaceful way. Confrontation of violence, but not choosing to take the path of violence ourselves. I'm hoping that I can share some more about what they're up to soon. At the moment, it can seem like the world is putting up walls and cutting off relationships, but we need to reach out to our neighbour and even reach out to our enemy if we want to avoid destruction.